Good evening, I'm David Kramer with the National Weather Service for Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska, get any updates to the forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line, 1-855-937-4977, get any updates through that means as well. Taking a look, we do have several warnings and advisories out. Focusing in on the flood ones first, we do have a flood advisory out for Willow Creek. That is until 4:30 p.m. on Friday. This image here that you can see on the screen is some of the flooding there that's being caused by a freeze up and ice movement on the river. So we are expecting those conditions to linger around until Friday afternoon around 4:30 p.m. Elsewhere, we do have a lot of snow expected for mainland Alaska. One of the heaviest hit areas will be the interior, where we do have out several warning and advisory products around mainland Alaska, including the interior. And this is going to include areas around the greater Fairbanks area. 4 to 6 inches are expected, with some of the higher elevations and mountainous areas up to 8 inches can be expected. There will be some winds up to around 20 miles per hour in town around Fairbanks that could cause some areas of light blowing snow. And then closer towards the summits, winds could pick up to around 40 miles per hour, so we could see some blowing snow up there. The heaviest time for the snow will be overnight tonight into Thursday morning. We'll look at our warning and advisory map here. We'll start off in the south, out over the Bristol Bay area. We have an advisory out that is starting to taper off, but we are seeing the potential for some freezing rain in that area. We already talked about the flood advisory for Willow Creek, and then out by the Valdez area, we do have high wind warning Thursday morning through Thursday evening, especially through some of the gaps like Thompson Pass. Could see those winds up around 75 miles per hour. As we move a little bit farther to the north, starting out on the west, we have a system moving through that is bringing snowfall to the area. A lot of the freezing rain potential that is in effect now into some of these later time periods around 6 p.m. for those western locations start to tapering off with that freezing rain potential. But that system will track farther to the east and transition over to all snow. So we are going to see a lot of snow developing this evening, especially over nighttime hours for much of the interior as that tracks farther to the east from the west coast. And that will include the Brooks Range and North Slope as well. Again, starting off in these evening hours with some of the snow, especially in those western locations, and then pushing farther to the east overnight tonight into Thursday morning, especially the eastern locations having snow linger into tomorrow morning. And that is going to take us into our satellite imagery, where we will see the driver of a lot of those warnings. This system that we have out along the west coast, you can see the front with that pushing through southwest Alaska with a little bit of clearing of those high-level clouds behind it. And as we watch this again, we'll watch as that cloud cover is pushing in over all of mainland Alaska, extending down into south central as well, starting to push that precip farther to the east as this system tracks southeast across southwest Alaska. Farther out to the west, we have another system coming in, moving towards the western Aleutians. This is going to be the next producer that we'll see a lot more of, especially as we get into Friday and through the weekend. That system will start to hit the west coast later in our period that we'll talk more about a little bit later. And for our weather for the remainder of today, we can see out over mainland Alaska that widespread snow from the two different lows that we have, one over the North Slope coastline and that one that we saw tracking on satellite through southwest Alaska. We are still seeing some of that light freezing rain with that system over southwest, but that should be wrapping up and turning over to all snow as that system pushes farther to the south and east. Out over the Panhandle area, we have high pressure dominating the area, clearing out a lot of the Panhandle. And then out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, we're seeing some lighter rain showers at this time, but again, we have that system out farther to the west, pushing into the western portions of the Bering Sea, bringing more precipitation with it and more warm air with it. As we move into tonight, the rain from that system is going to spread throughout the central and western Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, but region will have moved in over the west coast, clearing out all the west coast for much of tonight. It'll push off that snow farther to the east, so we will still have some lingering snowfall in areas around the central and eastern interior, including the Alaska Range, and then up through much of the North Slope as well. South central Alaska will still see some rain shower or snow showers from the system that's moved into the Gulf of Alaska tonight, and that will start to bring a lot of snow to the Panhandle area. Some of the low-lying areas in the central and southern Panhandle will start to see some rain, but primarily snow for the majority of the Panhandle from that low in the Gulf. Moving into Thursday, that low will have pushed off to the south and east, still leaving some lighter lingering snow showers for the southern portions of the Panhandle. High pressure will have moved in and dominate mainland Alaska, clearing out the majority of the mainland from the interior, North Slope, and for south central Alaska, with just some lighter snow showers underneath that dome of high pressure in isolated areas around the mainland. However, along the west coast, the system that is pushing through the Bering Sea will have brought in some warmer air to the west coast from the Yukon Delta area up through the northwest coastline, and bringing back potential for freezing rain mixed with snow along all of those locations. Behind this, we're seeing some warmer air out over the Bering Sea, so predominantly rain out over the Bering down through the Aleutian Islands. Moving into Friday, this system will really have started to make its way in and bring a lot of impacts to mainland Alaska. Still seeing a lot of warmer air riding over top some of the colder air that's in place along the west coast, giving way to some of those freezing rain conditions now extending from the whole YK Delta through the west coast up to the Utqiagvik area, where we will have that potential for freezing rain lingering as long as we keep having that warmer air overriding the colder air at the surface. Elsewhere through mainland Alaska, it'll be cold enough in the interior down through the Alaska Range and up along through the eastern portions of the North Slope to stay all snow. Out over the Bering Sea, still some rain from the central Aleutians through the Alaska Peninsula and up closer towards Nunavik Island, but further out to the west, we are expecting a lot of the precipitation to be a mix of rain and snow out for the western Aleutians into the St. Lawrence Island area. Taking a look at our temperatures, starting off in the Panhandle, primarily in the teens for lows Thursday morning, a little bit warmer by Sitka, 21 degrees expected there. Single digits to the 20s for south central Alaska, warmer along the Gulf Coast and colder in the interior locations, and then down below zero for the Glen Ellen area, down to -8. Thursday afternoon highs in the Panhandle, primarily in the 20s, warmer again farther to the south. And then a gradient of teens in the more interior locations of south central into the 20s, closer towards the Gulf of Alaska. For Friday morning lows, dropping down into the teens for the more areas farther away from the Gulf of Alaska, and then getting closer towards the Gulf and the Panhandle into the 20s there for those lows. For the south central area, single digits in more interior locations, a little bit colder for Kenai, down to -3, and much colder for Glen Ellen area and the Copper River Basin, down to -16. Around 20 degrees for those lows as we get closer towards the Gulf waters. Friday afternoon highs in the Panhandle in the 20s for the more interior locations, and then closer towards 30 degrees for areas closer towards the Gulf. For south central Alaska, primarily in the teens, and then up by 30 degrees for areas near the Gulf of Alaska. In the interior, we're going to see temperatures dropping down well below zero for Thursday morning for the central and eastern locations, near zero for the western interior, single digits for the eastern portions of the Arctic coastline and in the teens out west, and then down the west coast in the teens to lower 20s. Thursday afternoon highs getting up into single digits for much of the interior. Some places a little bit farther to the north are going to stay at or below zero. Western interior into the teens, and then getting up into the teens for the eastern portions of the North Slope, and then into the 20s for the western locations. 30 degrees for much of the west coast of Alaska. Friday morning dropping down well below zero for the central and eastern interior, single digits for the western interior, as well as along the eastern portions of the North Slope, and then dropping down into the 20s for the western areas of the North Slope, as well as the west coast. Friday afternoon highs getting into the teens for the central and eastern interior, 20s for the western interior, near 30 to the lower 30s for much of the Arctic coastline, and then in the mid-30s down the west coast. Low temperatures on Thursday morning for southwest Alaska into the teens to 20s, warmer near the water, and then near 40 degrees for the Aleutians. Thursday afternoon highs in the mid-20s to near 30 still for southwest, and then in the mid-40s for the Aleutian Islands. Friday morning lows dropping down into the teens to 20s again for southwest, and that's going to be warmest once again nearest to the water, and then around 40 degrees for the Aleutians. Finally, Friday afternoon highs getting into the 20s for interior locations of southwest, into the 30s for the areas nearest to the Bering Sea, and then into the mid to upper 40s for much of the Aleutian Islands, a little bit colder by the western Aleutians and Pribilofs.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Thursday morning. Out over the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and pushing into the southwest portions of the state, we have IFR conditions. That's due to that system moving through the Bering, bringing in some precip and cloud cover out to the west coast, as well as widespread throughout the Bering and Aleutians. We have some MVFR conditions for the Alaska Range and southern portions of the interior, as well as some areas up along the north slope. Down in the Panhandle, we have areas of IFR up north with some MVFR areas spread out into some of the southern areas and out by Yakutat. As we move into Thursday afternoon, starting to clear up in the Panhandle, just some IFR or MVFR conditions rather in the southern portions. Out over mainland Alaska, eastern locations are primarily VFR with some intermittent MVFR. And then out over the Bering Sea, Aleutians, and west coast, we still have widespread IFR conditions, again with that slow moving front out over the Bering Sea. As we move into Friday, similar pattern out over the Bering, Aleutians, and some areas along the west coast, still with that front moving through. However, behind that system, we are starting to see some improvement out by the western Aleutian Islands with some MVFR conditions out there. Much of the rest of mainland Alaska will be VFR conditions with just some intermittent areas of MVFR, and then VFR conditions expected down in the Panhandle. As we move into Friday afternoon, continuing to see VFR conditions down in the Panhandle and south central Alaska, and then some MVFR conditions moving into the interior. We still have some IFR conditions along the west coast from that slow moving system out over the Bering, and then some IFR conditions up along the north slope as well. Down by the Aleutians, primarily IFR conditions expected, but as we get into the north and western portions of the Bering, starting to clear up and seeing more VFR conditions. Taking a look at our passes starting up north on Thursday, AKwx will be MVFR, improving to VFR conditions in the afternoon, as well as at Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill will both start off MVFR and then improve to VFR in the afternoon, as well as at Rainy Pass. And then Windy will start off all the way down in IFR conditions, improving to marginal later in the day. Isabel Pass should be MVFR throughout the day on Thursday. Mentastus starting off IFR and then improving to MVFR conditions in the afternoon. Tenita will start off VFR and then drop down to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Meanwhile, Portage will stay VFR throughout the day on Thursday. Chilkoot and White will both start off IFR and then improve all the way to VFR as we get into the afternoon hours. Taking a look at our freezing level, surface freezing line is near the coast through the Panhandle and south central Alaska, as well as southwest coastline. And then some warmer air coming in from the south that is brought up by that system out over the Bering Sea. You can see the freezing levels getting up to as high as 8,000 feet as we approach the Alaska Peninsula and southwest Alaska. For our icing, we have areas of icing down over southeastern portions of the state, surface to 10,000 feet, extending out over south central as well. And then up along the north slope coastline area, we have a surface to 3,000 feet. And then out by the Seward Peninsula and St. Lawrence Island area, between 4,000 and 10,000 feet for icing is expected. Taking a look at our jet for Thursday, strongest portion of the jet is going to be out of the north over mainland Alaska in the central to the eastern areas. Coming out of Kaktovik, we're going to see upwards of 140 knots, dropping down to closer to 115 as we get by south central Alaska, still out of that northerly direction. Looking at 9,000 foot winds, we do have northerly flow remaining throughout mainland Alaska. However, the strongest area of winds is going to be down by Kodiak Island, getting up to near 65 knots there, 55 knots further to the north out by the Alaska Range, and 45 knots over much of the rest of south central Alaska. Calmer winds out by the Panhandle, but the rest of mainland Alaska should see winds 40 to 45 knots out of that northerly direction. Then finally down over the Aleutian Islands, southerly winds by the central and eastern Aleutians around 35 knots there, becoming stronger by the western Aleutians, near 60 knots out of the southwest by the western Aleutians. Down to 3,000 feet. Much of mainland Alaska is going to be a lot calmer at this level until we get down in south central Alaska, where we'll still see 55 knots out of the north by Kodiak Island, 45 knots for some of the areas around south central and Prince William Sound, and near 55 knots by Yakutat. Out over the west coast, we're going to see winds up to 45 knots out of the southwesterly direction, down for the Seward Peninsula as well, and then southerly winds down around 30 knots by the central and eastern Aleutians, picking up as we move into the central Bering Sea up to 45 knots and near 40 knots by the western Aleutian Islands. This is going to bring quite a few areas of turbulence throughout the state, below 3,000 feet for the Aleutians, below 6,000 feet for many areas around the Panhandle, below 6,000 feet for Kodiak, where we will see some areas of isolated severe, and then moving north through much of the southern portion of mainland Alaska below 5,000 feet, and below 3,000 feet for the northwest coast.
Our ancestors, as Inupiaq people, they had to adapt and overcome every single day. If the ice isn't coming in the way it usually does, we got to figure out a way to go and still maintain our subsistence lifestyle. Rural Alaska has the highest rate of suicide per capita for the entire United States. I lost 13 of my basketball teammates and classmates to alcohol-related deaths and suicides. I went to that dark place in my life. That's when a kid said, hey, you should try out for American Ninja Warrior.
More than 40,000 applicants.
So I built a ninja course. Unilocleat, you know, it's only accessible by plane or boat. You can't just go to a Home Depot or get materials. Went walking down on the beach and just picked up logs and turned them into Ninja Warrior obstacles, and that was my training ground.
Unilocleat is a community that sits where the Unilocleat River comes down and feeds into the Bering Sea. Much like other communities, Unilocleat relies on shorefast ice to protect it from storms throughout the winter.
And that ice kind of comes right up against the beach, and it creates this barrier between us and weather.
When that shorefast ice is gone, when that protective barrier is gone, it presents an immense challenge as that coastline is eroded.
Back in September, we had a big storm.
Basically flooded my entire course and tore apart like half of my obstacles.
And I was hopeless, you know, there was nothing I could do against the weather. But more importantly, we were wondering if we were gonna have to evacuate town. We were worried if we were safe or not.
The ice season in the Bering Sea region has shifted from November to June to January to late April.
By February, we'd have maybe 4 or 5 feet, 6 feet of ice by springtime. I used to help our aunties and grandmothers when they went ice fishing. If you're small, younger, 12 years old, you have to get inside that hole.
Sometimes it's so deep I can't even reach the bottom of my dook. And you keep chipping, but you can't pull the slush out.
When you get near the bottom, a water will rush up. If you're not careful, you'll get all wet. Now we're lucky if we get 6 inches, 12 inches a year.
You know, in my lifetime, I've seen the amount of ice almost diminish.
As you lose protective shorefast ice along the coast, communities are exposed to a rough ocean for much longer periods throughout the year.
You get a 20-mile-an-hour wind, those waves get pretty big, and they start eating away at the land that we live on.
Well, Unilocleat's a village of 750 people. There's a river on one side and then the ocean on the other side.
When you have storm surge, it's not only a rising sea, but a rising river as well.
We're lucky that we do have a dike made up of rock. However, that rock settles with wave action. The wave action becomes larger and just more water with full force hitting the beach. When this high water comes, it a lot of times can go over even the airport runway. And it brings in wood, it brings in rock. Well, we kind of become like an island. We're surrounded by water.
There are communities all the way from the northern side of the Seward Peninsula all the way down to the Aleutian Islands that are facing extreme rates of coastal erosion.
Beaches are kind of washing away. We're seeing a lot of landslides. We're seeing a lot of sinkholes.
Back when I grew up as a little boy, and we'd travel the ocean ice to Shaktoolik, about 44 miles, and we no longer can do that. We're having to travel on an inland trail, and a lot of times it's not enough snow or consistent rain melting the snow.
Our springs are thawing out earlier. The foundation of the frozen river is not as solid as it has been in the past. Last fall, my wife's uncle raced down to get some tomcats, got a few tomcats, coming back, fell through the ice and drowned. I need to haul wood earlier in the winter instead of waiting in the spring like we've been doing.
Sooner or later, our lowlands may get flooded out.
You know, moving out of here, it just has never been an option for me.
The only options are relocating, and some people are doing that along the hillside.
The community of Unilocleat decided to set up an allotment for young people that, wanted to have their own place to live. They wanted their own piece of land and their own home.
Get up in the higher areas for safety.
I want to, eventually have my own kids, and, I just wanted to have my own place and just, my kids to grow up and say, my dad built this house with his bare hands. Change is tough for a lot of elders. Like, this is their home. This is where they grew up.
It took me 25 years to pay off a 3-bedroom home, and I can't afford to even consider moving my home.
Born in Alaska, raised in Unalakleet. It's heaven on earth if you live here for long enough. Once I started doing American Ninja Warrior, the entire community just fully supported me. Here I am auditioning and sending you guys a video, so pick me. The producers of the show loved it.
Quickly through these first 2 hours is a wild ride. Nick Hansen, go on with your bad
It turned into this crazy phenomenon. So now it's just a matter of starting from scratch. It's an opportunity to start something fresh and start something new, and it's going to be amazing.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section of the forecast, starting off with a look at our ice edge. Down the west coast of the state, we still do have ice reaching down into Bristol Bay and all along the rest of the west coast. However, we are seeing a lot of southerly winds that are starting to erode a lot of this ice and push back farther to the north. And over the next several days, we're going to continue to see this warmer air from the south, which will continue to erode a lot of the ice along the west coast and push some of the ice up back into the Chukchi Sea. Taking a look into Cook Inlet, we do have some ice in both Turnagain and Knik Arm and starting to make its way into the northern portions of Cook Inlet. For the marine forecast down in southeast Alaska on Thursday, we have northerly winds in the inside waters, 25 to 40 knots out of the north, and then in the southern locations in the inside waters, southeast winds 20 knots expected. Seas are highest in the inside waters up to the north around 8 feet in Lynn Canal. Out over the Gulf waters, we do have gale force winds of 35 knots out of the south in the eastern locations of the Gulf, and then out of the east in the northern locations. For Friday, we are going to see continued northerly winds in the inside waters of 40 knots up north, down to 25 knots in the southern locations, and gusts up to as high as 60 knots near Petersburg. For the Gulf waters, we're going to see easterly winds predominantly, and that's going to be 25 to 30 knots in the eastern portions of the Gulf, and then 30 to 35 knots in the northern locations. For Thursday, out over Cook Inlet area, we're going to see northeast winds at 15 to 20 knots, and then out near the Barren Islands up to as high as 50 knots out of the northwest. We're going to see some strong winds in the gaps, especially in those locations nearest to the coastline and around Kodiak Island. And then out over the northern portions of the Gulf, 20 to 30 knots are expected, with 30 knots out of the north in Prince William Sound. For Friday, dropping down quite a bit in Cook Inlet, 10 to 15 knots out of the north around the Barren Islands, 20 to 25 knots out of a westerly direction, and then switching over to be more northerly in the northern portion of the Gulf, 15 to 20 knots, and 10 knots out of the north in Prince William Sound. For Thursday, for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, around Kodiak Island, northwest winds 40 knots. Once again, we're going to see stronger gusts through the gaps up to as high as 55 knots out of those gaps around Kodiak Island and Shelikof Strait. Then around the peninsula, we're going to see north to west winds 15 to 20 knots on the Bering side and 20 to 35 knots on the Pacific side. Then on Friday, calming down here as well around Kodiak Island out of a westerly direction around 20 knots, 10 knots on the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, and 15 knots out of a west or an east to southeast direction on the Bering side. For Thursday for the Aleutian Islands, starting off by the eastern Aleutians, southeast winds 15 knots, picking up to 25 knots for the central Aleutians and 15 to 20 knots by the western Aleutians. Seas up to as high as 13 feet on the Pacific side of the central Aleutians. Then on Friday, we're going to see primarily easterly winds throughout the Aleutian Islands, strongest out west by the western Aleutians, 40 knots there, seas up to 16 feet. For the central Aleutians, 25 knots, and 20 to 25 knots for the eastern Aleutians. On Thursday along the west coast, primarily southerly winds, 15 to 25 knots, weakest near the coastline and strongest as we get farther out into the Bering Sea. And then easterly winds 15 knots on the southern side of Nunavik Island. Then on Friday, we're going to see still predominantly southerly winds, 30 to 35 knots up north, 30 knots becoming a little bit more westerly north of Nunavik Island and out by St. Matthew Island. And then southeast winds south of Nunavik Island at 20 knots expected. Along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see 10 to 20 knots out of the west by the Beaufort Sea area, and then becoming southerly all along the west coast. Pretty light by Utqiagvik, only 10 knots there, and then 25 to 35 knots down the west coast. On Friday, we're going to see stronger winds along the west coast, 35 to 40 knots out of that southerly direction. Seas will be highest south of the Bering Strait, up to as high as 12 feet. Then along the Arctic coastline, southerly winds 10 to 20 knots, getting weaker as we get farther to the east. For a quick recap of tonight's weather, we are seeing quite a bit of snow moving in from the western portion of the state currently, but that will drift farther to the east overnight, bringing heavy snowfall for much of the interior, Brooks Range, and North Slope. We do have warnings and advisories out for these locations for that heavy snowfall. Snow is going to also extend down into south central, just a little bit lighter, and we are going to see some snow in the Panhandle as well from a low in the Gulf of Alaska. Low-lying areas nearest to the Gulf could see some rain as well mixed in with that snow. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, we do expect rain showers throughout those areas, especially to the west, with ridging extending in much of the west coast, clearing out a lot of the precipitation that we have seen today. For Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.